Hello all, it's great to be here, and today I'm going to be talking about code with confidence using PHPCS. Now, this is the first time I've actually given this talk, so if you've got any feedback, constructive criticism or whatever, please let me know at the end. That'd be great. So what I've done is I've split this talk up into 4 sections. First of all, we're going to talk about what does code confidence mean to me in the context of PHPCS. And then secondly, we're going to talk about what are coding conventions. Then I'm going to describe or explain how to install, run, and configure PHPCS. And then we're going to wrap this up by talking about how to increase code confidence with PHPCS. Before I get into it, though, let's just talk about who I am. So I'm Peter Fisher. Obviously, I'm a PHP contractor from the UK. I've got more than 20 odd years playing around with PHP. I'm also the host of How to Code Well. It's a podcast, YouTube channel, and I also do live streaming on Twitch as well. I've got courses and projects on various different programming languages, such as Python and PHP and JavaScript, all on the website there. You can get the slides from my blog, peterfisher.me.uk, so you can follow along, and you can also have a look at my badly spelt speaker notes. So, first of all, let's talk about what does code confidence mean to me. Now, this is in the context of coding conventions. So, in my opinion, there are 3 types of projects that every developer will face in their career. The first one is a new greenfield project. This is where we start from scratch. There's no code, there's no architectural decisions, there's no framework or libraries, and therefore there's no coding standards that have been chosen. We do, however, though, have a list of requirements. We probably have some timescales. The second one is legacy or brownfield projects. This is where we possibly could have a mixture of coding styles. This is where you get into a project that you didn't start with. So you're looking after a legacy application. You could be working within a team, and the team members will have more knowledge than you in certain areas. This project could have a mixture of frameworks and libraries. It could even have a mixture of different versions of, say, PHP, different things talking to each other. Team members who once advocated a specific coding style may no longer be in that team, and so you might have a cluster of different coding conventions. And then, of course, you've got the migrations and the rebuilds. So this is where you're migrating from one thing to another, and in doing so, you might be migrating from a convention. So you might be migrating from one code style to another. It could be that you're migrating from one framework to another. It could even be from one version of PHP to another, or a different platform. So when I think of these 3, I think of like the ideal dream, if you will. So with a new project, we want to start clean, continue clean whilst building up the confidence with the code base. So this means to be aware of any known style violations before the very first deployment, and to gain visual feedback on what parts of the code need adjusting before that deployment. And also to think ahead. So we want to spot any potential gotchas in our coding conventions for any new features coming down the line. And also we want to create a continual integration pipeline that reports these violations nice and quick and prevents anything from going into the mainline. We also want to ensure the team follows these same sets of rules, and we want to create a sort of a space, if you will, for discussions as to what conventions to use. Oops. With the legacy projects, we want to be aware of what the known issues and violations are in the projects. We want to know what different types of conventions are being used. We want to prioritize different coding smells, and we want to reduce any kind of team disagreements and arguments within, say, pull requests, because a pull request is probably not the best place for those discussions. And we want to make it easier for any new developers coming on board to know which conventions are actually required. For a migrated project, we want to ensure that the code standards can easily be adopted. We want to remove the old code styles if we need to, either defined or implied. And we want to minimize the amount of cross-pollination of styles as we migrate this project from project A to project B. So how do we get there? Well, we could use PHPCS. We could add that to our toolbox. In the greater context of code confidence, because I've done a talk before on code confidence with PHP Stan, this talk kind of follows that kind of approach. There are many different tools that we can put in our confidence toolbox. We've got mess detection, other compatibility checks, static analysis. We have tests, which could be unit integration acceptance tests, and the list of different auditing tools is quite endless. But this talk is geared around PHPCS. But before we go any further, I really need to give a shout out to PHPCS, which is the style fixer. So this is actually a bit confusing because they're actually called the same acronym, PHPCS and PHPCS. One's got a space and one hasn't. PHPCS, the one we're talking about, is PHP Code Sniffer, and this one here is the PHP Coding Style Fixer. This is slightly different. Actually, it's very different. It's supported by Symfony. It's got a different approach. This is using a fixer first approach, whereas the PHPCS, the code sniffer, which we're going to be talking about, is more about reporting and then fixing. It has a very different output style in terms of the report. And we can, and this one is configured, by PHP, and it only checks PHP, whereas PHP Code Sniffer, as I'll be demonstrating later, is configured by XML, and it can also check not only PHP, but also JavaScript and CSS. The important thing here, though, personally for me, why PHPCS is better for legacy projects than PHP Code Style Fixer, and again, this is personal preference, is that with PHP Coding Style Fixer, you can't ignore yet any individual lines of code. You can ignore the whole file, but you can't ignore portions of the code. And this is where PHPCS, the code sniffer, actually, in my opinion, is far better for legacy projects, because there's a whole bunch of code perhaps in your mixture of various conventions that you want to ignore. Okay, so I've just used the word conventions there. What does that mean? So from Wikipedia, we have this blurb. So coding conventions are a set of guidelines for specific programming language that recommend programming style, practice, and methods for each aspect of a program written in that language. These conventions usually cover file organization, indentation, comments, declarations, statements, white space, naming conventions, programming practices, and programming principles. Okay, so that was a massive mouthful. What does that mean? Well, essentially, boiling all that down means that we are forcing code to adhere to a given set of rules. In the case of PHP Code Sniffer, it is a set of sniffs. It makes the code easier to read because we're all agreed on a coding convention that we're going to be using going forward. It removes the ambiguity of which convention should be used within our code base, and it reduces the noise and debate within the pull requests. So you might be thinking, well, what's the point though? Because surely it doesn't matter what the convention is as long as the logic works, right? Well, not necessarily, because we read code far more than we write code. So if you're building a feature, you're going to be building that feature integrated within the rest of the code base. So you're going to have to read the code around the feature that you're creating. Also, when you're debugging code, you're going to be stepping through all the code up to the point where you've got your breakpoint. So you're actually going to be reading a lot more code than you write. And also, switching between conventions is a bit of a brain drain. If you're looking at two very different contrasting conventions in the same file, in the same method, then that can get quite confusing and actually quite tiring. Okay, so let's now talk about PHP Code Sniffer. So we can get this from Squiz Labs PHP_code sniffer on the GitHub repo. It has been around for a long time. It's actually supported from PHP 5.4 and up. It uses, as I mentioned, XML for configuration, and it has multiple reporting outputs. So let's talk about how we actually install this and configure it. So This is how we would install it from Composer. Notice here, I have a global argument here. We're installing it globally onto our machine. And that is because this is a great tool that can be used for any project that you have. That's why it's installed globally. If you want to install it, however, per project, then I certainly recommend doing it using the development dependencies. This shouldn't really be anywhere near production. We can, of course, use Perl, curl, wget, and git clone to install it if we wanted to. And out of the box, we get two tools. We get PHPCS and we get PHPCBF. So PHPCS is the tokenizer for PHP, JavaScript, and CSS. It is the tool that checks your code for the given coding violations, quote unquote, sniffs that you've declared in your rule sets. PHPCBF, on the other hand, is the automatic fixer. So this will take your code and take the violations and automatically, or attempt to automatically fix them based on the rules that you've provided. In your first run, what you want to do is run PHPCS and give either the path to a specific file or a path to a directory to recursively check. When things go well, you don't actually get an output, which is great. But when things don't go so well, when you start catching errors, you get this lovely little report. And here what we have is the file that we're checking. So this is the Connect controller. And we have one error, which is affecting one line. It's on line 24. It is an error. It's not a warning. This is why it's the build's failed. We have an explanation as to what is wrong. So expected 0 spaces after the opening parentheses, and we found one of them. And we've also got a message underneath saying PHPCBF can fix the one marked sniff violations automatically. So if we change our attention from PHPCS to PHPCBF, we can now fix that. So we run PHPCBF against that one file, and we have this report. This report will say what has been fixed, what line, and if there's anything remaining, because PHPCBF won't be able to fix all of the things. Okay, so what is a sniff? I've used that word a couple of times. What is it? So a sniff is a file that checks one part of the coding standard that you've defined. And the coding standard is a collection, therefore, of sniffs. A coding standard is essentially a directory and a ruleset.xml. And that ruleset.xml is the file that contains all of the sniffs. And by default, the standard that is being used is pair. Okay, so what's a rule set? A rule set, as I mentioned, is an XML file that configures the coding standard. It can define things like exclude and include rules. It can include the output rules and include sniffs from other rule sets. And you can see there's a link here for the annotated rule set if you want to have a look at some more info. So let's say, for example, we've created a rule set, and I'll just go to what that means in just a second. But to use that, we want to do PHPCS, and we give the standard, the argument -- standard to that rule set. And then again, the next argument would be what it is that we want to check. So this time we're going to use our custom rule set.xml. And at the moment, our custom rule set looks like this. It's very simple. In fact, it's just a small little XML file where we're declaring the name of the rule set and also the sniff that we want to use, or the other rule set that we want to use or import, I should say, into this, which is PSR1. So this is going to import all of the PSR1 rules within our custom rule set. And remember, our custom rule set is the coding standard. I know I'm using a lot of words that kind of all mean the same. So this is how we add another rule. So we got PSR1 and PSR2. And the rules are made up of various different parts. They're actually made up by 4 parts. We have the standard, the subset, the sniff, and the error code. This means that we can traverse this very sort of granularly and tailor how our rules are to be used within our rule set, or tailor the sniff, I should say. So we got PSR2, that is the standard. So we're using the standard of PSR2. The subset is classes. The sniff is class declaration, and the error code is the open brace on new line. Okay, so now we can granularly grab those bits and pieces from the rule. What we can do is we can exclude parts of the rule from our own rule set. So here we've got our rule set, it's PSR2, but we're actually going to exclude the open brace on new line from the class declaration sniff. We can also override parts of the rule. So what we're doing here is we're overriding the generic.files.line length, and we're setting our own properties as to things like line limit and also absolute line limit. Now, the difference between these two is that you get a warning when you hit the line limit of 90, and you get an error when you hit 100 and above. We can also tailor the output to give our own message. So the message I've created here is, the line is too long. It's not a very good message, but this is just to demonstrate how we can update that message if we wanted to. We can also exclude things. So what I'm doing here is I'm excluding the vendor directory from all of our rules. So this means that we're not checking the vendor directory against these sniffs. Okay, so what standards are installed? If we ran PHPCS -I, we can see all the standards that we're running. So we've got pair, PSR1, PSR2, PSR12, Squiz, Zend, HTML, and I've got security, and of course the my source as well, which is the custom one. We can also go into the actual rules and output what the rules are actually doing in output. So what we're doing here is we're providing the standard, which is my source, and we're providing a generator. So the argument standard equals my source and generator is equal to text. This is going to output this text table in the console. And this will give you an example of what it's trying to validate against. So here we have an example of not allowing underscores in the property names of classes. So we've got a good example and a bad example, or a valid example and an invalid example. We can also pass in Markdown if we wanted to actually produce this as a document. So we can actually use a generator of Markdown. Okay, so configuration time. How do we configure it? Well, this is an example where we're using -p and -v. These arguments, -p shows the progress of the run. -v prints the processed files. -d is a key value pair for PHPINI. So in this case, what we're doing is we're saying memory limit, and we're giving that a memory limit. I've skipped one. Extensions. So -- extensions is a comma separated list of file extensions that we want to check. So for any of you Drupal developers, you want PHP and also INC. And of course, we can supply a parallel argument too. So the amount of processes to run. And below there is the output of what that kind of looks like when that's going ahead. And there's tons more arguments. It's just a handful that I've chosen there. If we wanted to, because that's a bit of a mouthful to supply each time to PHPCS, we can actually do this within our rule set. So this is going to enforce that every time we use PHPCS, we're going to be using these arguments. So argument value PV, which is -p-v. We have arg name is equal to extensions, passing in the PHP and inc. And then we have ini, which is the -d, so that we got the memory limit with a value of 1024 M, and then we've got the parallel argument 2, and then we have file. Now, file is either a file or a directory that you wish to check. So this is where I think PHPCS is awesome. I mean, it's awesome anyway, but this is where I think it really shines. So we can ignore things really granularly with PHPCS. So in this case, we're ignoring a file. So if we wanted to ignore the whole file, we would put this right at the top. So PHPCS colon ignore file, that will ignore the whole lot. But we can also ignore parts of the file by disabling and enabling PHPCS, which is awesome. Just to give you a bit of my experience, I remember there was a project that I worked on, and there was a function that we found, or a method, I should say, in this class that had over 24 arguments, parameters that we could supply, and it was just like a crazy minefield of trying to work out what these things do, whether they're required, what kind of this was all pre-type safety, right? And so what we were able to do was just disable and enable that check for that specific thing, and then we would be able to go back to that later and fix it. But yeah, anyway, so ignoring parts of the file, this is very, very powerful. We can also ignore sniffs as well within our code base. So this is going to disable the generic commenting .todo.found. And what this is doing is it's saying, well, the first two lines are actually going to be checked by PHPCS, but the third line, the to-do line, is not going to be checked by PHPCS. And then we're going to enable the whole thing again. If we wanted to, we could ignore a line like so. So we're ignoring the line foo. We can also do it like this. So we've got PHPCS colon ignore on the same line as the line that we wish to ignore. And of course, we can ignore the specific sniff as well. Okay, so what else can PHPCS do? I mean, I've showed you a lot of awesome things that it can do, but there is so much more. So I've only got two things here, but what I'm going to show you is the security side of it. So you can use various different GitHub repos to add packages to give you the ability to check for security vulnerabilities. So this one, for instance, comes with CVEs. There are a whole bunch of other GitHub packages to check out as well. Also, what is very cool with PHPCS is it does PHP compatibility checks. This is so cool for legacy projects that want to be moving on to or migrated onto different versions of PHP. So going back to that migrated thing, what we can do here is say, check my code for versions of, say, PHP 8, or if I'm on PHP 5, then check it on PHP 7. And we do that like this. Appreciate it's a bit small, but what we're doing is PHPCS -p, that is the path, and then the standard is the PHP compatibility standard. That is in the vendor directory that we've installed. And we're going to set at runtime a test version, which is PHP 8. So imagine, if you will, that you have multiple pipelines. The first pipeline is going to check it on your current version, and then the second pipeline, or you could have more than one, checks it on various different versions. So you will be able to keep looking forward to the next version update, and you won't be surprised or shocked when you are asked to check all the things for a next version bump, because you will be already aware of a lot of them. Okay. So, let's talk now about increasing our code confidence. We've talked about how awesome PHPCS is, and I've demonstrated how to install it and configure it. But going back to the soul of this talk is confidence in our code. So how do we increase that using PHPCS? Now, I've got some recommendations for, say, any project, new project, and legacy and migrated projects. So we'll spin through those. So a recommendation for any project is to use a pipeline. So PHPCS, PHP stand, perhaps static analysis, PHP unit. You could be using PHP mess detection, all of that stuff. What I would suggest you do, though, is use PHPCS first. The first thing you do in your pipeline is to check for coding violations, coding standard violations. The reason being is that if there are any of those things, you're going to have to fix them, which means that if you're testing PHP unit first and that passes, but you've got coding violations, then you're not actually going to be testing the code that's actually valid, right? So you want to be doing all your validation checks first in terms of the auditing, and then you want to be doing your testing afterwards. Okay. Also use one command to do all of these things. It just makes it so much easier for devs if there's only one command to do all the things. So if you use a makefile, have a make test command. If you're using Composer scripts, then just have Composer test, and that will run through all of the pipeline, and then use the same thing in the actual build server. So when it's being built and moving across. And that's what I've just said, continual integration. So you want to enforce that the code that code cannot be merged into the main line until all the things pass. There we go. Also, for any project is to test only your code. Don't test things in the vendor directories. Don't test any code, check any code that is automatically generated on your behalf. So for example, migration files for doctrine. Don't bother checking those. What I would say though about this is if you're a Symfony dev and you're using, say, the maker bundle, and you want to generate, say, controllers and stuff, you're obviously going to be playing around with those files. So do check those. Okay. So recommendations for new projects then. So don't ignore lines, files, or disable sniffs unless you really have to. This is because it's a new project. So if you disable anything now, going forward, you'll probably forget what you've disabled. And so that's going to trip you up going forward. And also document why you are ignoring them if you're going to. Okay, you want to have justification and ownership as to why you've actually done that. So recommendations for legacy projects is to choose PHPCS or PHPCS, investigate which conventions are currently in use in your application, get an agreement with your team as to which conventions to use and which to drop, right? And if anything needs to be ignored, then write a ticket down and add the ticket reference into the comment. So this is an example of what I mean by this. So we've got a ticket port 123. So this is a typical Jira ticket. And the reason why I've put this down is because that example that I mentioned with the method of 24 odd arguments, you want to fix that, right? Going forward, you want to fix that. And so you want to document why you didn't bother fixing it then. It was a time constraint. And also how you would fix it going forward, any kind of investigations. And also, if this is Jira and you put it in the Jira backlog, that means you're going to have to fix it at some point during, that you'll pick that up during refinement. So it's not just left in the ether. Okay. Ooh, okay, so confidence levels for legacy projects. So I have 3 confidence levels for legacy projects. The first one is that PHPCS is already in use. It's already in use, and any ignored files or lines have been documented with a related ticket in the backlog. This gives me a high confidence level. You can tell I deal with a lot of brownfield legacy projects. This gives me a lot of confidence. So PHPCS is installed. This is the second one. However, lots of files, lines, and sniffs have been ignored with no explanation. This means that you're allowing your developers to just ignore things willy-nilly without any kind of consideration for the future goals. This gives me a low confidence level. You may as well just not have a coding style if you're allowing people to ignore things left, right, and center. Okay, and the third one is that PHPCS is just not installed at all, and that gives me a low confidence level. This could be because that perhaps the developers on the team are just not aware of PHPCS or just don't care for coding conventions. This means that you need to do a little bit of education around those things. Please show them this talk. So how do we improve a legacy project then? So things that I would suggest is to collect all the ignored files, lines, and have a meeting with the team to discuss a way forward. Should we be ignoring this? Why are we ignoring this? And how do we sort this out? Can the ignored items be fixed and the rule therefore be included? And you want to start very, very slowly and work your way up. I've had experience with projects where there are multiple coding conventions, and the amount of people who've been in the project before me and have their own styles that they bring to the table, because they're just not aware of what styles to use, because there are 5 different styles all over the place. So they just pick one or make one up. So yeah, you want to draw a line under that and say, right, okay, let's analyze where we are, create a document that we can all agree on, and go forward. And that's summarized here, really. So get the buy-in of the team, choose the standards, and run PHPCBF over the code base to fix any quick wins. Document the standards that you are using and the standards that you're not using. Start to introduce new sniffs and rerun PHPCBF over the code base. Put code formatting changes in a separate branch and PR. That's important. Don't do any of this stuff whilst you're actually dealing with a feature. Another bit of my past is I foolishly created a branch where I was doing a feature, but then I also decided to do a lot of other things as well, including PHPCS. And that feature never actually saw the light of day. And therefore I had to cherry pick all the things that I had committed to fix all the other things. Don't do that. Don't do what I do. And then essentially rinse and repeat the process. You want to, in the document, you want to give a brief explanation as to why you chose that standard, also why you chose PHPCS or PHPCS Fixer. Now, you can actually use both of them together if you wanted to, and you want to provide examples as to the coding conventions that you're using. Now, this point is really, really important. Give this document to new starters. Say, hey, look, we are trying to improve our code base. We know that we've got multiple coding conventions going on right now, but this is our defined, decided, agreed upon set of conventions. This is what we're doing going forward. We've got things in place to prevent new code from being updated. Something I haven't included here is that you can use the git modified flag to only check modified files. I should have put this in, but this is showing your new developers, your new starters, that you're actually wanting to improve the code quality of the application. And make sure that this is very obvious, either by pinning this to Slack, emailing around the team, and make sure everyone has a buy-in about it. Okay, so I've spoken about a lot of things. There is a ton of other things I could speak about, including how to install PHPCS in VS Code and PHP Storm. I have links in the resources section here. I've also got links in for security audits. The wiki of PHPCS is amazing. Go and check that out. And also the pair package and the GitHub repo. Thank you ever so much for allowing me to talk. If you've got any questions, let me know. Cheers.